My name is Shekhar Shah. I'm the Director General of NCAER. I want to start by apologizing to Sonal and to her team and to all of you for not having been able to join you for the last day and a half. I can't say I was in a very difficult climate since I was in Kathmandu, actually in Nagarkot, which is even better than Kathmandu. But I'm certainly very aware that I've missed some very important discussions, and I'm going to try and make up for it by hoping to provoke a very distinguished panel to think about what should be the priorities for the new government. And with that in mind, the title of the session itself asks the question, what should the new government do that the word prior is missing here. It does say, what should India's new government tackle what no government has been able to tackle? And we do know, of course, that there are many countries around the world, some with lower per capita incomes than ours, that have been very successfully able to tackle the malnutrition problem that they faced. So it is really any prior Indian government. I'm not going to spend any time standing between you and this distinguished panel. What we're going to do is ask each of the panelists, and I'll introduce them, to take 10 minutes to talk about what their priorities ought to be. And I started out by sending an email to them 2 days back, asking a bunch of questions, and of course they were free to add their own. But the key idea behind those questions was, is malnutrition or addressing malnutrition rocket science? And if it isn't, then is it a managerial / technical / process problem? And it could be, of course, not just food, but could also be sanitation, water, a whole range of environmental conditions. Or is it political? And by political, what I had meant was that education seems to have got on to everybody's voter or vote-getting key idea. Health perhaps less so, and understandably because of asymmetric information and other kinds of problems. And malnutrition perhaps even less so because of the lack of voice and agency. So if it's not a managerial and technical problem, then is it a political problem? And it could be a combination of both. And how can the new government possibly tackle and show significant progress during the course of its term, so that by 2019, if we are gathered around in a similar way, would actually be reviewing significant progress in the direction of reducing malnutrition for children and particularly women. So with that in mind, I'm hoping that each of my distinguished panelists will take up to 10 minutes. That will leave us with about an hour for really a conversation with them and with you, which I think will be as exciting as the first part. There's an order that's on the program, and with Sonal's permission, I've changed the order a little bit, just in the way in which I think it'll be a little more interesting. And knowing Larry's very powerful abilities to summarize and lay out issues, I'm going to start with Lawrence Haddad, who is now at IFPRI, was until recently the director of IDS Sussex, and of course has been a very important player in the thinking about malnutrition, food insecurity, and poverty. So I'm going to start with Larry, and then I'll move on to the other panelists and introduce them in order. And I'd appreciate if people can hold their questions for the hour that we're going to try and preserve, so that we can really have a very fruitful discussion. And I have a timer here that Larry can see and others can see. So we hope we can keep to time.
Thank you. So my chair has surprised me in 3 things. First of all, I'm first. I was hoping to coast and be fourth on the list. Second of all, there's a big green clock watch here ticking down. I've already used 12 seconds up. and 30s call me Larry, which I'm not used to hearing, but that's okay. I'll get you back later. I've got 5 points. So I'm the outsider on the panel. I'm the one who knows India the least well. But maybe that gives me an opportunity to be a bit more provocative than maybe some others. I think the first point, I've got 5 points. All 5 of my points, they're not saying we should do more on sanitation, we should reform ICDS. Those are important, and I think those messages are really important. But I want to get at the level behind that, which is how do you begin to generate and act on those messages and generate other messages. So first of all, I think I'd like to see the government seize the moment and change the narrative around nutrition. The narrative around nutrition in India, promulgated by people like me and others, is economic growth is growing pretty fast. Okay, the last couple of years it hasn't, but in general it's much faster than many other places in the world. And yet look at what's happening to stunting rates, not much. Now, if some of the data we've been hearing about in the last couple of days is remotely accurate, if stunting rates really have gone from 48 in 2005-6 down to 30, mid to upper 30s in the last in 7 or 8 years, that's a respectable rate of reduction, and I think that's sufficient to support a vision for 20% stunting rate by 2020. That would require a modest acceleration of the existing rate. So first of all, develop a vision for nutrition. Make it an issue that previous government couldn't grapple with, but you can. You're a can-do government, you can grapple with it. Why should you grapple with it? Because, okay, it's important for mortality, we care about that. It's important for morbidity, we care about that. It's important for chronic disease and NCDs, we care about that. But it's also vitally important for education. If that's one of the top priorities, it's vital for that. If you care about economic growth, it's vital for that. So it's a fantastic way of sustaining economic growth. It's a fantastic way of making demographic transition a dividend and not a liability. So change the narrative around nutrition, develop a vision. That's the first thing. I think it's a fantastic moment to do that. To blame the past government for all the bad things, and of course that's what politicians always do. That happens in the UK, I'm sure it will happen here. But it is a great opportunity. Second, I'm sorry, as part of that, join the scaling up nutrition movement, or encourage states to do so. I think it's a very important international signal. And again, I'm still on my first point, and I'm running out of time. Combating undernutrition is part of a vision of a modern 21st century India as a global leader. Having 40% of your kids stunted is not consistent with being taken seriously on the international stage. And if the government cares about that, they should be caring about this. Second thing is, and this is really harking back to some of Nina's points from the first day, appoint someone centrally who is empowered and accountable for nutrition, and only for nutrition. And it could be a former president, someone very high profile who's got sort of broad-based approval. I actually am a very big believer in the power of individuals to change things, and we saw that from the Orissa example that Rasmi talked about today. She said it took I think it was the secretary of the ICDS in Orissa who made it her mission to make these different groups integrated at the state, district, and frontline levels. It was that one person made a difference. So I do believe you need a focal point at the center, someone who can say, someone you can hold accountable. What's happening? Someone who can play a convening role. I think there should be an annual report on the state of nutrition in India, and that person can help make that annual report feasible. Third, don't be afraid of the data. Past governments seem to be terrified of the data on nutrition. Look how, if we believe the current data that we're hearing about, showing stunting at 35, 37%, look how misguided that fear of the data is. You could be claiming credit for good stuff that's happening, but you're not claiming credit for it. Don't be afraid of the data. Have an NFHS 5 in 2017. Have an NFHS 6 in 2020. It's a trivial expenditure for the benefits you'll generate. Fourth point, find out where your money is going on nutrition. It's not as if the Indian government is not spending money on nutrition sensitive or nutrition specific activities. They're spending a lot of money on it. But do we know where it's going? Do we know if it's mostly going to these 10 nutrition specific interventions that the Lancet talks about? Do we know if it's going to nutrition sensitive agriculture? Do we know if it's going to sanitation that's really going to make a difference to nutrition? Do we know if it's going to women's empowerment activities? Is it going to PDS? Is it going to other types of social protection? Where is it going? Do an audit of your current budgetary spending on nutrition and figure out whether the allocations match the priorities. That would be my fourth thing. Before you spend lots of extra money, figure out where your current money is going. And then finally, final point, be a global leader in research. Be a global leader in research on undernutrition. I'm kind of amazed that there are so few funding pots that Indian researchers can apply to do serious evaluation work, whether it's process evaluation work or internal validity, RCT type stuff, or whether it's external validity stuff, or whether it's anthropological or ethnographic. It seems like it's actually very difficult to find funds to do anything that's beyond a very small scale piece of research. I'm continually surprised by how few really good impact evaluations there are of ICDS, PDS. We've seen some good evaluations today and yesterday, but they're essentially relying on really creative uses of data that were collected for other purposes. Collect some data for this, and only in that way can you begin to focus dialogues, because at the moment anyone can say anything about anything because the results are not definitive. We've had people in this room say ICDS doesn't work, and we've had other people say ICDS does work. And really, it's really hard to stick your hand up and say, well, actually, that really good study said it does work, or it doesn't work. So you just perpetuate really counterproductive, I think, debates without any good evidence. It's like one of my colleagues at IFPRI says, there's more reviews of the evidence than there is evidence to review. So create some more evidence. You would expect a researcher to say that, but I really believe that. Think about creating a center of excellence on nutrition that pulls together all the fantastic people. Maybe it's a virtual center, but a center that pulls together all the fantastic work that's being done by NCAER, PHFI, all the others who are doing this work. Create a national evaluation fund for nutrition. Stimulate a new generation of evaluation. Revamp postgraduate and undergraduate teaching. And set up a knowledge management platform that facilitates learning from state to state and even district to district. So I think I'm going to stop there. I think if 1 through 5 are essentially addressing, they're trying to change the conversation about nutrition. It's trying to say, look, India is not the world's worst. It's not the home. It's not going to be the home to a third of the world's malnourished children forever. We're going to do something about that. It's not the place where you look for disconnects in economic growth and nutrition growth. We're going to do something about that. We care about economic growth for this generation and the next generation, and because of that, we're going to invest in nutrition, which is going to reduce morbidity, improve school outcomes, and improve labor productivity, improve, our friend who was talking about jobs. It's going to be creating jobs and also improving the wage rate once you're in a job. It's about a legacy for this government. This government, I don't know, probably won't last beyond 10 years at most, but the legacy of that kind of investment in the next 4 to 5 years will live long beyond their own life. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. And this time I'll say Lawrence.
I don't have a nickname, other than I'd share that privately with you that you could then do a tit for tat, but I apologize, Lawrence. So I think this is really fantastic. You've laid out a research-oriented, but also a political agenda and a political challenge for the new government. So now I'm going to turn to Veena Rao to kind of pick up the thread of what she had started with in her keynote address on Monday, and reflect both on what she's heard, but also perhaps in some sense respond and build on what Lawrence has said. But from her vast experience currently as the advisor to the Karnataka Nutrition Mission, but also, of course, with all the important positions that she held in government, the last being the secretary in the Ministry of the Northeast. Veena.
Thank you, Dr. Shah. Actually, as I said, you made our job so much easier by writing us that very, very comprehensive letter and summing up whatever you wanted this conference to achieve. And I will try and reply point by point to what you have suggested. Now, what you asked is whether overcoming India's malnutrition is rocket science. Of course, it's not. In fact, part of the problem is that the solution is so simple that nobody takes it seriously. So, coming to the policy side, you have asked whether our policies are poor. No, we have a very strong policy, but just about 20% of it was implemented, and it is not monitored at all. That answers your second question. Then you ask, where does the problem lie? Diet related? Yes, indeed, in two ways. One is, there is evidence about a dietary deficit amongst the bottom 30 to 40% of the population. They are NIN reports. But I have, as I said, yet to see a researcher take cognizance of that while they are evaluating the causes, the structural, systemic causes. This is always ignored, and I earnestly request the researchers, very eminent people present here, to kindly take note of that when you are working on your various theses. The other part of the diet-related problem is that there is lack of information about what a proper diet is, and I can speak with experience from the field about it. And the very fact that we have half the population suffering from some form of malnutrition, whereas our poverty line, even if you stretch it to 40%, you still have 10% who just require information about how to improve their nutritional status. And that brings me to the point you have made, and Professor Haddad also made, the economic consequences of it. In fact, it is very sad to see that a lot of the young, undernourished boys in rural areas looking for jobs are completely barred because of malnutrition and stunting from being employed by the largest employers in the country, and that is the police and the army, because they don't have the height or the chest measurements. And I think that is such a sad thing, and you have these young boys. And incidentally, I think I mentioned it earlier also, that the percentage of adolescent boys who are undernourished is more than adolescent girls, understandable, because they require more food during their growth spurt. Then I come back to the point I made. Why do we just consider this a women and children's problem? In India, it covers all age groups. It covers adults, men, women, adolescent girls, adolescent boys. So let's get out of this women and children tunnel for malnutrition and look at it as a population problem, as it is done in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. I have attended a meeting where some of their representatives were present. They don't treat it as a women and child issue, they treat it as a population issue, and Planning Commission in Pakistan handles the subject. Right. Now, program delivery you talk about, we don't have a program to combat malnutrition. I don't think anyone can debate the point that reduction of malnutrition is not an objective of the ICDS. It was a mistaken association which crept in during the plan perpetuated, crystallized, and has never left it. So I do hope, Dr. Shah, next time when you have your follow-up, let us talk about malnutrition, within the population perspective. Then you come to the problems of managerial, diet, sanitation related, definitely, yes, all of it. Intra-household also. Now when it comes to sanitation, you do not have a field level worker who is an ally of the ASHA or the Anganwadi worker who will say, yes, I will provide sanitation to this house. Now in the pilots that I'm doing in Karnataka, we have a village nutrition worker, and we have now reached the stage where sanitation toilets are actually being constructed in the houses where it's just started, because you have to sequence activities. You cannot have all 5 or 6 activities together, but anyhow, that's for another conference. All right, then you come to technical, managerial know-how. There is a complete lack of technical and managerial support on this issue in the states and in the districts, blocks, villages. There isn't any at all. Your Panchayati Raj institutions do not know the subject. NGOs do not understand the subject. They want to work in it, but they do not understand the various intersectoral aspects and several other public health related aspects of addressing malnutrition. And government has not helped in creating a template which they can follow. You see, all national programs which have templates have marvelous NGOs who chip in and they assist and they get results, but malnutrition does not have a national template, and therefore the NGOs, though they want to help, don't know how to help. So they, each one picks up whatever is their favorite activity, whether it is advocacy, whether it is some additional supplementation or something like that. But that entire integrated set of activities, they do not have a template, and there's no know-how. Now talking about worker employability and nutrition, well, enough, as I said, has been written about it in India. I myself have written about it in 0708. But I think the larger nutrition community must also make it a very important point of their research agenda and their various publications, because somehow people who were taking economic decisions were not interested. But I think, as Professor Haddad has said, seize the moment, tell them about it, because there will be people who would listen. Now, the last question, which, how much do you know? 4 minutes? 5 minutes, okay. Right. So you have also asked about where the private sector comes in and how we can motivate them to partner with all of us in addressing this problem. Now, as far as pure private sector activity is concerned, I am of the very firm belief that they should be motivated, and as I said, I do not believe in giving monetary incentives or subsidies, but they have to be told to come out with a whole range of low-cost energy foods for women, for children, for adolescents. We have nothing of that in the market. You go to any, I don't know whether it is overdone in the West or not, but there is such a huge range of affordable food with children, women, girls, everybody can eat there in case they've missed a meal or something like that, or when somebody is ill. We have nothing of that sort over here, and my inquiries to the rural area where I'm working is, when I ask them, what do you give your child when the child is asleep? Ganji, which is, gruel of rice. Or some of the slightly higher end people say bread and jam. So this is what is given to children when they fall sick. When elderly people fall sick, they are given just the usual gruel and nothing at all, tea or something like that. So I can't, when we see all this, I'm not surprised that our nutritional status is in this, it is of this dimension, because initiatives which should have been coming from several sectors have not. And I think Professor Haddad made a very, very valid point. We are not proactive in government. We are reactive. And there's one fragmented intervention is loaded onto something which is already creaking, and then we say it's not working, or we say it's working and we have done this and therefore our work is over. And as far as the CSR is concerned, I again of the very firm belief we must have a template to offer them. You know, it is such a complex array of causes. It requires such a complex array of interventions. And what is most important is that very few people in India who know how to make those interventions work. And that is the model that has to be built up. It's such a simple answer, basically. I would make a list of what are the causes of India's malnutrition. Women, children, girls, boys, men, women. What should be done? What are the interventions that are required? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you've been discussing it over the last 2 days. How do we put it on the ground? That is the answer to how to solve this problem from you know, in a very integrated manner. But unless this very integrated exercise is done, and yes, and lastly and most importantly, how do you make sure that all these integrated interventions actually happen? Now there you require a lot of expertise, a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge of how actually the village works. And your convergence happens at the village. If you can get all the households that are getting ICDS intervention, they are getting anything additional, which I hope a national program will bring, additional supplementation. If you have 40% of your population whose diet is below RDA or whatever, you're not going to have a proper nutritional status. So you have to supplement for the very poor. And we are doing that in the pilots that we are doing, and the results are phenomenal. So making sure for the next 10 to 15 years that these interventions happen is what should be in that national program. And you asked about what should we tell the Prime Minister. I think we should tell the Prime Minister, let's get on with the national program. And there is already a Prime Minister's Council, so I'm sure that will be restructured. And for goodness sake, let's strengthen the mandate of that council. Sri Ranjan didn't agree with me, but I had a look, and there are only 2 terms of reference, and they don't make very much sense to me. Terms of reference are that the terms of reference are limited to providing policy directions and reviewing nutritional programs. There is no objective to providing, setting up a program to reduce. I think I've gone past my time. Thank you, Dr. Shah.
Thank you, Vinay, for that impassioned and yet very pragmatic view of where we should be pushing in terms of the agenda. Would you want to just take another 30 seconds and talk about what Lawrence referred to your original suggestion of creating an authority that could be held accountable, an individual who really passionately cares about this? But just very briefly.
Yeah, no, I would just like to respond in a very bureaucratic manner, because there is already in place the Prime Minister's Committee, which he chairs, which has certain members. And there is this mandate, which I believe is not strong enough. I think we could start from there. In any case, I'm sure the Prime Minister will be reconstituting his committee, and it's very important that proper people get in there who know the subject, and that's the place where putting the interventions together into a national program or whatever, everybody has very valuable suggestions, I'm sure, but that would be the point.
Let me then turn to Keshav Desiraju. Keshav, as we all know, is secretary in the ministry, in the Department of Consumer Affairs, in the Ministry of Consumer Affairs, but has also been secretary in the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. So he's eminently placed to, in a sense, respond from his own current work, on what the government is thinking. And Vinay, you didn't refer to the last question that I threw in, saying, here's an opportunity in July, Mr. Jaitley will be reading out the budget speech, and that may be an important platform for them to pick up what is already in their manifesto about undernourishment, and to be able to give firm shape to the kind of things that they want to do. Keshav.
Thank you, Dr. Shah. Thanks very much. I'm very glad to be here. I'm not sure if I can really say what the government is thinking, because this is information that I don't know. And the question we need to ask is, does anyone in the government know as to what is to be done in this particular area? Now, we've listened to two very important sets of statements, and I will want to pick up on some of those things, because I think there are some important ideas which I would like to add my voice as well. Now, the one important idea I'd like to throw into the discussion is that nutrition has no institutional home in the government setup. And this has always been a problem. The Planning Commission has tried to play this role, but like everything else the Planning Commission does, has never been taken very seriously. The other point that Mrs. Rao made of the exclusive linkage of nutrition to A, to women and child development, and B, to nutrition, to ICDS, is, I think, has also been a very major stumbling block. What this government needs to do, and I think this phrase has been used, we should seize the moment. This is a government that is now talking about restructuring existing institutional arrangements. It is a very strong case to be made for proper institutional responsibility for handling the entire nutrition subject on a population basis, as again Mrs. Rao said, to be housed somewhere in government, not in the Planning Commission, but housed in one of the executive ministries. The Health Ministry is certainly a very good candidate for this, because I think when we talk about nutrition programming, the whole point of ensuring adequate nutritional status of our people is to ensure healthy people. And it's a strong case would be made. That, I think, is something that we certainly need to do. I like the idea, because the linkage to one strong, powerful, charismatic individual, even if we can't find such a person, even if it became part of a regular ministry's work, it would be extremely important. Now, the other point made by Mrs. Rao, the linkage to women and child needs to go. If you look from the health side, if you look at tuberculosis, every single person in this country suffering from TB is suffering from bad diet. Drug-resistant TB, which is coming back in a big way. Something like the last figures I saw was something like 60,000 persons in the country have MDR TB. Almost inevitably, in addition to the very intensive medication they get diet supplements. Now, if you are going to tackle tuberculosis in this country, you're going to have to look at diet. You're going to have to look at adequate nutrition. We're going to have to look at the kind of nutritional problems faced by the very large number of mainly men who are living in the big cities on the streets and doing a factory job or something or the other. Now, these people are left out of any sort of nutrition program. A very important area that we do very little on is occupational health and the inclusion of proper meals at proper times as part of the whole work routine. We are told that the Maruti factory in Gurgaon had a fairly good model working in this area, by which they ensured that everybody got fed properly at the right time, irrespective of income levels. Now, so that the important point made, break the link with women and child. Remember that there are also a large number of adult men and women who are either hungry or underfed in their different situations and need to be addressed. The second big thing is, I think we don't want to spend time on what has gone wrong with the programs we've implemented. That ICDS is a nightmare is something that we all know, and I don't think we want to spend time on that. But we must also remember that government only works through a program approach. If I have to ask government to make huge investments into nutrition, I need to find the appropriate vehicle which will not see wastage, which will see a proper decentralization decision making, which will be in a position to make appropriate responses to specific situations. All the things that ICDS, for instance, has not been able to do, or midday meals administered by the Department of School Education has not been able to do in a similar fashion. So we have to look at, while being part of a program tends to restrict us, equally I don't immediately see an option beyond outside of a program approach, especially if large investments are to be made. The third thing is that there is a problem with government programs. Unfortunately, whether we like it or not, there is a close association that a government program like a government school or a government hospital are meant only for the poor. Now, how and why this notion has come about? It has come about. So ICDS, my own experience in ICDS has been that actually it is the poorest women in the village who will take their children to the ICDS scheme. It is likewise true of midday meals. In many villages, certainly in North India, there is a perfectly hopeless private school functioning which draws students nonetheless. The midday meal being served in government school is not an attraction because the midday meal is now seen as something where only those children go who are unable to get a decent meal at home. Now, that government program should have been reduced to this is a very sad reflection of the way we do our work. However, it's not lost. I recently had occasion to visit a very, very interesting and impressive program in Andhra Pradesh called the Indiramma Amrita Hastam. Now, under this program, hot cooked meals are served every day in an ICDS center to expectant mothers. And I went to 3 or 4 of these centers in the course of one afternoon. It was quite clear from the way in which the women were dressed and the way they spoke that they were not the poorest women, but in fact all pregnant women were turning up for that meal because it was the operation of the exercise was transparent, the kitchens were clean, it was other village women who were cooking, it was their mothers and sisters who were cooking. I was actually impressed by the fact that through a governmental system, the association of a government program with very poor people was broken. And you had women who may not have sent their kids to the ICDS center, but who are coming themselves for the daily meal that is being cooked there. So it can be made to work. Linked to this, Mrs. Rao raised the point about supplementary foods. I still believe we should be careful. This whole discussion can get completely out of hand in India. We have had enough experience in the past of the pitfalls of a supplementary nutrition program. My own sense of this is what we should be looking at is a cooked meal at home. What very large numbers of children need is a meal cooked by their mothers in their own homes, not necessarily something cooked on a communal basis. Women can maybe get together and eat meal in a common place. What children need is a meal cooked at home. The Ministry of Agriculture last year moved a very ambitious proposal for setting up what they call agri farms, which began with a very good idea that the village would put together in a range of vegetable crops and cereals a certain amount of excess that could be pooled and used for communal cooking or distribution to be cooked by women in their homes. Unfortunately, this collapsed because they wanted to introduce the Food Corporation of India into regulating the distribution of food. So, but then there is a germ of an idea there that villages could be encouraged to pool together extra both cereal and vegetable crops to be then distributed to households in the village through the Panchayat Raj institution necessary, so that the women are in a position to cook in their own homes. The 2 last points I'd like to make. One is we cannot be talking about nutrition in isolation to the whole discussion on the empowerment of women. It's for this reason we may need to retain some linkages with the Ministry of Women and Child Development. But it is not discussion that can be held in isolation. That what happens to women, the conditions under which they live, their access to opportunity, their access to schooling, their access to employment outside the home, these are all hugely important when it comes to what they are able to get them to do in terms of cooking in their own homes or what they are able to cook for their children. It's not a discussion that can be divorced. And lastly, Mrs. Rao mentioned the public health approach. This is crucially important. and it's something which the health system has lost. Public health education, as a system of education, has been undervalued. The public health approach to disease control is neglected. The entire approach has been so exclusively disease control focused that there is a disease cured with this medicine. The public health approach, which would urge that you concentrate on drinking water, sanitation, nutrition, empowerment status of women, as being contributory factors to the health status of the family. That approach is completely gone, and there is a strong case. In fact, this brings me back to what I began by saying, that the Ministry of Health really needs to assume a more substantive responsibility for integrating healthy meals, integrating better nutritional practices as part of the healthcare system. And then I think we begin to see progress and begin to see better figures than we do right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Keshav. Again, I think a very important set of ideas that resonate quite fully, I think, with the contributions that Lawrence and Meena made. Now I'm going to turn to my friend Shivashish Upadhyay to perhaps bring more of his thinking in terms of how government should address this issue. Shivashish, as you know, is the director of the Shivnada University's program in economics and also the research director of the India Development Foundation. Indeed, he is the founder of the India Development Foundation. He and I go back a very long time.
Thank you, Shekhar. It's very difficult to come in as number 4 and still come up with new ideas on what is to be done. But I've always felt that it is better to say what should not be done, because that way you are clear that you do not want to do certain things, and being very skeptical about what will happen tomorrow, day after, etc. Since the future is uncertain. I always shudder to think the way Indian policymakers think, which is, okay, this is what we should do, this is what we should do, that is what we should do, that approach, right? I would much rather that we make sure that we don't do some things and then, go on experimenting and figuring out what is the right way to proceed. Because we are a very diverse country. We have no idea how we are growing or how we are going to grow. Right? We do have ideas about how we grew 2 years before, but we still have no idea about how we are going to grow. So I will start by talking about some things that I hope we do not repeat while we are trying to develop policies for getting rid of undernutrition. Now, however, the first thing I must say is I do agree with Lawrence and Meena and Desiraj that we need to attack this problem in mission mode, right? In the sense that it cannot be a regular an addition to the policy making that we are going to do. This is too important in an aspect not to attack it on mission mode. And in that context, indeed, making a person who is well respected beyond politics, right, beyond party politics in particular, right, to lead that mission, as Lawrence suggested, I think is a brilliant idea, right, because that person has to be visible to everybody and everybody should be able to associate with that person. Again, I hate to mention names because I do not want it to be political at all, but something like Abdul Kalam was as president, right? He won, he had general respect, right? It's not important which government's president he was. So something like that is necessary. And the second thing I want to endorse, right, is what Lawrence said in terms of funding for research. For somebody who has been trying to do, right, research in economics in India and ended up becoming a pure theorist, is simply because it is impossible to get funding for research in India. Social science, I mean, right? You can get a lot of funding for the sciences, but you get no funding originating from India for doing social science research. And essentially what it means is that the type of problems we get involved in, because we bring in a lot of funds from abroad, the type of problems we get involved in are those which are of general interest or of interest to the sponsors. It may not necessarily be of interest in our context. And therefore, if we want to solve the problem of nutrition, what Lawrence said should be talked about. That we need to fund our researchers, right, to go out and figure out what the problem of nutrition is in India. And I think that's very, very important. So I completely endorse that. Okay, so now coming back to what I promised you, I would say that is what should not be done. I think the first thing that I want to stress is that there should not, an attempt should not be made on creating a national plan. You have a mission head, as Lawrence suggested, right? So you have a mission head who is going to be held responsible for us reaching a targeted outcome within a specified number of years with, in between checks, as he said, 2015, 2017, 2020, right? We can have those checks on the mission leader. The mission leader is not there for 1.5 years. The mission leader is there from the start till the end of the program. That is how we must plan. But the mission leader should not come up with a national plan with a bunch of experts. We are a highly diverse country. Various regions will need various types of interventions. As long as there is one person who is held responsible for the outcome, so there has to be a uniform outcome indicator. But the way they're going to be implemented has to be left at local levels. Right? Now, how the mission head does it is the mission head's problem, but should not come up with a national plan. Second thing that should not be done is we should not build new institutions. Today, in a very, very small way, we already heard the conflict of interest between the ASHA worker and the Anganwadi worker today in the morning when we were talking about incentives to the ASHA workers or the Anganwadi workers saying, why the hell should I get involved? Right? So we have problems with creating new institutions, right? And the creation of new institution is costly. I think we should do some hard work, stop thinking about first best policies, do some hard work, take the institutions that we already have, right? And try and fit our policy to those institutions. And here again, the local institutions become important, and therefore local delivery or the local process of delivery becomes very important, and therefore decentralization is better than any centralized plan. And third, I completely support what Desiraju said in terms of our health system is meant for the poor. Our PDS is meant for the poor. Anything that the government does in India is meant for the poor. We must give up this line of reasoning. We have already seen, we have already heard today that there is no direct correlation between poverty and nutrition. Right? We've already heard that. Therefore, nutrition is not a poverty problem. The moment we start thinking for the poor, we think that sub-quality processes are okay. Why are government hospitals so bad? Well, because only the poor go there. Why are government schools so bad? Because only the poor kids go there. This has destroyed our entire country. So this is a new, I'm very happy to know that there has been no policy on nutrition, no recognizable policy on nutrition. So it's a great opportunity to start afresh and not think about it as a policy for the poor in India. It's a policy for the citizens of India. Right? We want a younger generation to be well nourished. Now we know, we have the data to support this, that it is not that it's only the poor who are undernourished. Right? Both across the world, as Dr. Saxena pointed out, as well as within India. So let us not think about it as a thing for the poor. Now, I have 3 minutes, or close to 4 minutes. So now let me talk a little bit about what I think, what I'm afraid of, and therefore I would like to put it out in the open since we're starting afresh, or we're hoping to start afresh, that we have to start believing in incentives. Even when we criticize policies and even when we try to think of incentivizing people, we still do not really believe in incentives. And I'll give you an example. A new CSR law, there's nothing to do with nutrition, but it just gives us the way we think. A new CSR law was done last year, and it's going to be applicable from this year. Now, the interesting thing is that there are many countries which are interested in CSR, which we have also picked up. We're a global economy, we read a lot, we're scholarly people, so we immediately know that every other country is also thinking of CSR. So we also picked up on it, right? And what did we do? We passed a law which said that every corporation, right, earning above a certain amount of 3-year profit, there are lots of conditions. But Basically, corporations should be spending 2% of their before-tax profit on CSR activities. And now we are talking about what template to give them, how they should do, what are acceptable CSR activities, etc., etc., etc. Now, just to give a signal as to what economists mean by incentives, is a similar law or similar support to CSR activities has been given in the UK. And in the UK, the law states that government contracts, companies which won government contracts, will be given points because of their CSR activities. Now that's an incentive. What we have done in India is not an incentive, but we have done a CSR law. Now I hope that when we are talking about nutrition, we don't go like this, right? We really have incentives built in. And if we start with the mission head, then you can actually consistently think of that. The mission head is held responsible for outcomes. Give the mission head enough flexibility to decide how it should be implemented, in which part of the country, for which sections of the population. Don't do a national plan. It's the mission head's responsibility. However, the mission head is held accountable in terms of a uniform indicator that is being used across the country. So that is called incentivization. Incentivization does not mean I build up the plan and then whoever is doing the last mile delivery, I give them an incentive. This has been working with NGOs, this has been working with ASHA. In everything we do, the incentive comes down only to the last level. That's not called believing in incentives. At every stage, we must build in this incentive thing. And so very quickly then, 2 quick points. One we can discuss later, that is all markets are related. Even in today's morning discussions, we were discussing markets in isolation. When we are talking of nutrition, we were not thinking of other things. When we are talking of MSP, we are not thinking of nutrition. These are all related, right? And you have to be able to look at them together. And finally, one problem that we face whenever we try to do something is that we claim that we are a poor country. I think we should dispel this notion. And I'll give one example. Why? Because that country today comes up with the highest or the second highest PQLI, right, quality of life index, the best place for women, all of those indicators. That's Sweden. When Sweden went on its path, the so-called social welfare path, it was one of the poorest countries in the world, not just in Europe. So it has nothing to do with poverty. It has to do with leadership. It has to do with the intelligentsia, waking up and saying that we are not a poor country. Or if we want not to remain a poor country, then we must start doing things from now, not wait for fiscal buoyancy. That's a completely dangerous.
Thank you, Shubhashish. I'm actually making a list of very explicitly political views or political approaches to putting this on the front burner that have so far emerged, and I hope we can go back to that. Let me go to our last panelist, Ranjan Sankar, who is the Director and the South Asia Head for the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition.
Thank you, sir. Good evening. I think the country has a new government, and considering the mandate the ruling party has received, I think it does have the political capital to support any kind of a new agenda. And it's apt and timely that we have framed this and we're discussing as to what we can go to the government with as recommendations to get rid this country of this kind of malnutrition. I will just make 2 broad statements and then give a few broad points. The first statement is that despite sound intentions and commitments, despite generally supportive policies and several programs in place, the situation of Indian children has not shown an improvement commensurate with the kind of investments that are being made. To simply say, the existing programs are not adequately addressing the needs of malnourished children in this country. The second broad statement would like to make is, we have made progress, but the progress is very slow and is uneven. The aggregate levels of undernutrition are certainly shocking, but the aggregate country statistics really hides more than what it really reveals. There are significant inequalities across states and socioeconomic groups. Girls, rural areas, the poorest, scheduled caste and scheduled tribes are the worst affected. And what is really worrisome is the fact that these inequalities seem to be increasing. So clearly, we have two Indias, with the second India in dire straits. This India is poor, insecure, and unhealthy. The clearest single indicator of that deprived condition is hunger and malnutrition. The clearest indicator of an improved well-being for the second India would be improved nutritional status. Addressing hunger and malnutrition in the second India will certainly require not only diligent effort by individuals and institutions like what we have, a number of important key interventions and strategies that have been proposed by the esteemed panelists, but what it really requires is a major commitment from the government and also a new sense of responsibility amongst those who are living in the first India. They've totally been disconnected with this. Now, before I go to the couple of points that I would like to state, I think in the existing one, I'd like to suggest two broad approaches that we may have to consider. Firstly, over the past few decades, we know that the best of policies and intentions have not found faithful implementations on the ground. At least we should insist that the focus should be on what is getting done rather than what is getting announced. It's new government, there is a lot of euphoria, we don't want more announcements. We've got to find a system by which it can be done. This is easier said than done. This would really mean, and we should urge for a lot of cultural changes in the system, moving to a culture of empowerment and enablement, moving away from rigidity and control, and moving more towards decentralization. The second approach, which is lacking in this field of nutrition, is like health. Nutrition is also primarily in the domain of state governments. So the approach must be really inclusive of the states. Now, as I mentioned earlier, some of the few points, not going into the nitty-gritties of what we really need to do, but I would like to place before you the broad ideas that we need to ponder on. The first is the government, we must urge the government to come out strongly and visibly. They must reaffirm the government's commitment to lead the fight against malnutrition. Unfortunately, we didn't hear anything in the President's address. This got missed. And we believe, and many believe, that this is a major, major problem that India is facing. It is clear when benefits of any intervention or any measure accrues not only to the individual but to the society as a whole, any sovereign government has a moral obligation to take it to scale and make it accessible and available to one and all. We know that public and quasi-public goods with substantial positive externalities. There are a few components related to monitoring, feedback loop, to improve, course correct the program. They would all have to be a part of implementation. We will go into that. The next point I would like to make is that the focus we need to shift to the consumer, so that I would like to call a population beneficiaries. They're actually consumers, they have a right, so that the problem and solutions can be reappraised in terms of their perceptions and attitudes. The creation of demand is completely lacking, and it is absolutely necessary. Our programs, particularly ICDS, is really a hardware-oriented program. There is so much of concentration on the supply factor, on the assumption that demand will automatically be appeased by supply. So we need to move, and what is really needed is a kind of a mass mobilization to increase demand and also increase community ownership and community participation in this. The last of the big surveys done, many of the respondents in the Hangama survey, close to 85% of mothers did not even recognize the problem, nor did they feel the need for any of these nutrition interventions. Now, my last point is, though we say that, I have mentioned that we want the government to be in the driver's seat, there's certainly need for collaboration and partnership with all relevant sectors and players to solve an intractable problem like malnutrition. By relevant sectors, I mean both the government, the civil society, the private sector, and also collaboration with other sectors which can bring in nutrition sensitive interventions to the table to make a synergistic value and really enhance the impact that we can get. We do recognize there are many existing examples of successful solutions in India, but unfortunately many are working either in very small scale or very slowly. What we really need is to collaborate to create and implement sustainable solutions at scale and at speed. I just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sankar. Again, for a somewhat different view, but I think one that will be very useful for us as we open this up. I heard at least 3 or 4 approaches being laid out that seek to broaden the support, the political support for tackling undernutrition. One, that the political moment is now. And actually, when you think about what little we yet know about a 15 or 16-day-old government, resonates actually very well with some of those ideas about broad-basing the political support for dealing with undernourishment. One, it's not a woman and child problem. It really should be a population problem. That men who are unemployable because of stunting, because of cognitive difficulties in their development, they are as much a part of the problem and as much a part of the solution that needs to be produced. Second, that it's not just the poor, and that by keeping it as a poor program, you will get, in a sense, not the kind of broad-based universal support, political support for dealing with this. Third, it shouldn't just be a central scheme, really have to use the imagination, the innovation, the creativity, and the political challenge that states themselves face in dealing with this issue. And this, of course, resonates extremely well with the new government's and its leaders' views on the relationship between the center and the states, particularly since he himself has led a state for several terms. And then at the end, Dr. Sankar talked about making this a consumer problem. It's not just a problem of a woman or a child, but it's really an average consumer problem that needs to be addressed. Let me lay these out as potentially approaches to broadening the political base. We have a lot of understanding of the managerial difficulties, the resource difficulties, the technical and design difficulties, but we need the kind of political momentum that, in a sense, and it's striking that Shubhashish talked about Abdul Kalam Azad, and I was thinking when I wrote, is this rocket science? And I was thinking, so we did have a rocket scientist who actually was in part involved with our somewhat more destructive ballistic missile program. But perhaps we need somebody with that passion and mission to be able to drive this. Let me stop here and then just open it up. Please just state your name and you can use this method of raising the flag if you wish to. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm Meenakshi from the Delhi School of Economics, and I wanted to put 2 points on the table which come out of the panel discussion, and I should note that my background as a researcher will be evident in the points that I make. The first is I thought Lawrence's point about we need more research. It's no surprise that that appeals to me. But on one specific issue, I think the international research community has also let us down. And that one specific issue is India different. So in a lot of the papers that I was reviewing that were handed out, there is a sense that India is different. The WHO tells us that the BMIs at which we start to become at risk of being obese and having cardiovascular disease is different as compared to the international community. We have the WHO telling us that vitamin A supplementation is wonderful, it's going to help reduce mortality, but we have a trial of 1 million children in Uttar Pradesh which suggests that there's no impact on mortality. So should we be buying into the Lancet reviews, the systematic reviews about specific things to be done in India? That's one thing I'd like to say. Or is India not different? Is it just circumstance? And there are multiple examples I could give. And the second point, I think, is what's missing from the discussion is the cost. If I have 1 rupee and I need to improve child stunting, should I be spending it on the ICDS? Should I be spending it on water and sanitation? Should I be spending it on the PDS? What is the mix? Yes, there's no magic bullet. It's a multifaceted problem. It needs a multi-pronged approach. But I get no sense whatsoever of what is it, where is the greatest bang for the buck. Our attitude, I think, is it's such a big problem, let's throw everything at it. And maybe that's okay. But I also think that given the disciplines and professions represented here, we need to have a better understanding of what those costs and benefits are.
Thank you. So what I'll do is I'll take a round of questions and then we'll ask the panelists to engage. Please, next to.
Thank you very much. It's more a comment than a suggestion than a question. All the good comments that were made, maybe they could be related to what exists of international initiatives in similar areas. We have the post-millennium development goals, which will come up after 2015. We also have the Secretary General's Zero Hunger campaign, where at least 2 of the 5 objectives are directly related to what has been discussed the last 2 days. The benefit of it in itself related to these initiatives will not solve the problem, but it will probably lead to an increased commitment on the part of the government if they are part of an international agreement where there are specific goals. And for the Zero Hunger campaign, there is a conference in the beginning of August organized by Professor Swaminathan, where the plan is to launch a Zero Hunger campaign in India. So I think if these international initiatives could be linked up to the proposals you are preparing here, I think it would be beneficial. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, next to him.
I am Mala Mukherjee from Indian Institute of Buddhist Studies. I have two observations. Like that, all the nutritional programs, they cover either women of the reproductive age group, children, and adolescent girls. But there is no nutritional scheme for adolescent boys, working men. You have rightly pointed it out, and also for the elderly women or menopausal women. These people are left out, and all of them need specific and different health programs, and many of them are suffering from anemia also. And another thing is that for a successful nutritional scheme, we should say that all the schools should have pediatrics and who will tackle both malnutritional problem along with obesity or overweight problems. And they should have counselors and enough scope for physical activity for the students. And the second observation is that all the nutritional scheme programs, many scholars have told that there should be a convergence of WCD and the Health Ministry, but I think Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment should converge with health and nutritional program to see whether there is any discrimination, social discrimination is going on or not.
Thank you, Mala. I'll take one more question and then we'll... Sonal?
I think the biggest issue that has been identified is that people who are facing the problem don't often know that they are facing the problem. It's sort of until it becomes a very severe issue. We also don't have a grassroots advocacy for nutrition. So if we want to take lessons from the education sector, Assar is a fantastic example. I remember Rukmini Banerjee tells this story that she really likes, that in one village they kept testing these kids, and the Pradhan didn't say, oh, all our children are going to school and they're doing really well. Okay? And we are administering this test after test, and suddenly he says, oh, kids don't seem to be learning how to read. We need to do something about our schools. Seems to me the one way of dealing with this would be to have basically camp where weighing and measurement gets done once a year for every child in the village, where you actually print out something which says that where is the child on the standardized score, turn it over to the parents, and if possible have a tracking system for severely malnourished children so that they could be addressed immediately. And for sort of moderately malnourished children, parents know that there is an emerging problem here. But if we can do it even for a substantial number of villages, there will be an overnight advocacy that would sort of build at a grassroots level and might actually have an impact.
Thank you, Sam. So I think we've 4 very interesting thoughts, ideas. Anybody on the panel would like? Harsh, you usually have a... Yes, well, let's get 5 and then Harsh, yes, please.
Thank you. I was worried by some statements in the panel which seem to suggest that we need to separate the question of nutrition from the question of poverty and inequality. I was grateful that Shankar brought inequality back to the center of the discourse. The idea that programs for the poor will always be poor programs need to be balanced with another idea that Ramji had always talked about, which was of the last person first, of making our programs, imagining our programs for actually the most disadvantaged and making them sensitive and making them central to our discourse. And I do believe that there's a big danger, especially when we're talking about this new government, because there's a great deal of energy in this new government, but it does come also from a certain belief system that efficiency, private sector-led reforms and so on. And buying into that, it can lead to a devaluation of really thinking about programs for the most disadvantaged. And just as Supreme Court Commissioner, over the last many years, one of the most difficult things that I've been doing, and I think, is actually investigating starvation deaths. And these are hidden, but the kind of how endemic they are, what kind of suffering is involved in them. I decided to do a small study about just 30 cases actually of children who had died a few years ago, and it had gained a lot of national attention. And the odd case which is discussed in the legislatures, etc., etc. What happened to those families? We went and looked for those families. We spent about 6 months with just writing it up. And it was even more tragic because their conditions were much worse now after the years had passed. 230 million people sleeping hungry, footloose labour, circular migrants, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, Muslims, slum dwellers. We know denotified tribes, nomadic tribes. We know a large street children, homeless people. There is this, not just this other India, but within that other India, this bottom 10-20%. I think that they should be the center of our discourse and not at the periphery.
Thank you, Ash. There are ideas here that both resonate and contradict things that the panelists have said. So, Vishesh, you want to start?
But I don't want to, but if you allow me, I will.
I encourage and urge you.
So let me start with the last point. This is very, very important, right? The fact that we are working for the citizen doesn't mean that we leave out the poor. We have to get rid of this mentality, I think. That the moment we say that the Indian citizen is important, we are going to leave out the poor. Where the fact of the matter is that in these last 60 years, we have tried to address the poor. This is not what Gandhiji said. We are trying to paraphrase Gandhiji into explaining, right, why we are doing the horrible thing that we are doing, where we are just allowing the poor to survive. We are not helping the poor to come up like any other average citizen. Why? We are building DTC buses where nobody but the poorest of the poor or students with free passes are going to travel. We are making our trains and our railway stations, right, horrible, dirty compared to the airports. They are both public goods. They are both being produced by the same government, right? So why is it that we always think that since we are doing it for the poor, it can be of any level or any quality? We have to get rid of this. And the only way we are going to get rid of this is if we start thinking of our citizens. That it doesn't matter whether you are poor or rich, right? This is what India must have. This is what every Indian citizen must have. And only then we are going to have a mindset change and stop doing what we have been doing for the last 60 years, is all that I'm going to say. I'm not suggesting that we don't carry the poor with us. The second thing I want to say is what, Meenakshi, you have definitely disagreed with me, right? By asking the question of trade-offs. I was saying that we have enough resources. We don't have to decide whether we want nutrition or education or health. Right? We need all of them. And the only way we are going to get anywhere, become the 21st century, developed India, is if we do not try to think which one gives us the biggest bang for the buck. So your question on trade-offs.
Not across outcomes. Anyway,
And the last point I want to make is, I think Sonal, you said about incentivizing villages having, right? In the morning somebody talked about there being competitions among villages to have the best indicators. Right? I think that is what mission mode is all about, right? That's what leadership is, right? Where the prize money is not important, the prize is important, right? You get covered in the national newspaper. Like giving awards to the best teachers in schools. I don't know if anybody keeps track of it. In Odisha, we tried to collect good teachers, and it was so easy, right? There are so many good teachers who were all being awarded, and that creates its own incentive. Right? So there are many ways to implement this mission mode approach to nutrition through these, we have this thing about the, what is it called? The cleanest village, right? We have prizes for that. So, yeah. So why don't we do the same thing for nutrition? Let's make it into a movement throughout the country. That's what mission mode means, right?
Lawrence?
Just to respond to your comments, Chair, I do think it's about generating political momentum and about politics. It's not rocket science, but it's not simple either. I mean, there are technical considerations and there are capacity issues, but it's when the technical solutions are aligned with the capacity available or the capacity that could be developed quickly and the political opportunities, that's when you get movement. And I think we've got to be cognizant of all three of those things. Just in terms of specifics, on Harsh's point, I certainly don't think that poverty and undernutrition are unrelated, but they're not perfectly related. If you look at even the highest income quintile in India, the stunting levels are still 20%, 15-20%. So it's not just about income. But the poorest quintiles are 50% stunting, so it's definitely about income and poverty in part. But I think more importantly, the things that generate poverty are very similar to the things that generate undernutrition. And even, I think, governments of all political persuasions, the definition of what a government is supposed to do is to address three things, it seems to me. And I think Modi's government will be paying attention to these three things. One is to address externalities, things that you do and I do that affect somebody else. And malnourished mothers generate malnourished babies, unfortunately, and that is a very cruel externality that's generated over the generations. Information asymmetry is another thing governments are supposed to correct. Power imbalances and access to information and knowledge about information. And as Sonal said, oftentimes families, mothers, communities don't know that they're stunted and they don't know the consequences of that. So again, that's another rationale for public investment and action. And the third rationale for public action and investment is missing markets. You can't tell me that a poor father or mother can go to a bank and say, invest in my child for the first 3 months of it, the first 3 years of its life, because in 25 years' time it'll be earning a higher wage in the labour market, and it'll be able to pay you off. That kind of market doesn't exist. So I think there's a very strong economic rationale for public action in the nutritional field, and I think we've got to go with, you can challenge the precept of growth first, social stuff later, and I completely do not agree with that completely at all. But you can go with the current proclivities and sort of smuggle nutrition in as a Trojan horse and undercover nutritionists and all that kind of stuff. So I'm with you. It's a long-winded answer to your question, sorry. On Meenakshi's point, I think the question about priorities is really important. I really duck that question, because I think it's a really impossible one to answer at a national level, perhaps with the exception of sanitation. But when I think of efforts to address malnutrition, I think of it as economists, and you all know this, economists have gone through sort of a revolution of thinking about how do you generate economic growth. And it's really, if you think of a barrel, right, a barrel that you have water in or something like that, you don't build a barrel by having horizontal planks. Barrels are always with vertical planks. And the amount of water that a barrel can hold is only as big as its shortest plank. Right? So if you've got 20 planks that are the right height and one plank that's halfway down, all the water's going to run out because of that one short plank. And I kind of feel nutrition is the same way. If there's one thing that is really weak, one weak link in the chain, that's the thing you need to focus on before you focus on anything else. But I think the problem is there isn't one barrel. There are hundreds of them, and each one will have a different short plank. And so I think the most critical ingredient really is the political will to do something about it. Now I believe political will can be built, you don't just wait for it. And I think data and information and evidence is a big part of that. So that's the bit I tended to focus on. We do tend not to focus on costs, you're quite right. We tend to focus on, does this affect this? And if this has a bigger elasticity than that, we tend to assume that's the thing you focus on. Well, actually, the cost of generating that elasticity may be much higher for this than that. So I completely agree with you. We're cost-free, we work in cost-free environments, and we have hardly talked about costs at this conference. And I think that's something the conference organisers need to go away and reflect on. Your final point about is India different? I think I think you're right. I think the Lancet series that came out, there was 4 papers in the Lancet that came out last year, and they once again, one of the papers once again said these are the 10 interventions that seem to work pretty much everywhere. And that's based on a systematic review of efficacy and effectiveness studies that were quite good. And what they do is they say, well, if we've got 10 studies from around the world that all seem to be pointing in the same direction, we therefore generalize and say we think this intervention, because it works in these 10 places, will probably work everywhere. And I do think that that paper, it's a very good paper, but I think it's liable to be interpreted as these 10 things have to happen everywhere in the same way. And they clearly don't. First of all, we don't have the capacity to do all of those 10 things everywhere. And even if you did, you would design them differently in each place. So, but the one area where I do think India is not different is the standards for kids between the ages of 0 and 24 months of age. The evidence says that kids from a healthy environment, no matter where they are in the world, they grow the same between 0 and 24 months of age. Beyond that, there are legitimate scientific differences, it seems to me, about when puberty hits and all that sort of stuff. But for that age group, I think India is not different.
First about this point about India being different. I'm not something wrong here? Oh, okay. Yes. No, I don't know the details which Professor Haddad is referring to about what he considers similar between children from 0 to 24 months. Is it? Right. Okay. But by and large, the causes for malnutrition in India, I think, are quite different from the rest of the world, because here they are very women-centric. It is the status of women, the status of the adolescent girl, the status of a pregnant woman, the diet intake of a pregnant woman, which is very relevant to the intergenerational cycle. Now, that doesn't happen in Africa or in Asia, There it is more, I think, because of food scarcity or famine or conflict, etc.
I'm not disagreeing.
Sorry?
I'm not disagreeing with you on application.
Oh, but I was interested in the details. Yeah, and there's that famous thing, that's one of the first few things I read when I entered into this field, and that was that an African pregnant woman puts on an average 10 kgs of weight, whereas an Indian pregnant woman puts on between 4 to 5, and I've seen it myself. Actual cases which are monitored by us. So I think to that extent, India is very different as far as the causes of malnutrition are concerned. And the second thing about the mission mode, I think everybody seems to have agreed that there has to be a mission mode, and as Dr. Desiraju said, that government functions only through the program mode. There is no other way government functions, because government requires money, and the money comes only after various sanctions are received and programs are approved. Now, there also seems to be some view that ICDS should remain the mainstay. Now, having seen it both from New Delhi as well as from the state governments, my view is that the ICDS is a very old program. Mindsets are very fixed, hierarchies are very well established, and even for any small alteration or adjustment or a new component to be loaded on the field, it's impossible. It's so difficult. So that is why when there is such a huge range of what I call simple interventions, but as Dr. Haddad rightly says, they are difficult to implement. The recipe is very simple, but putting it and rooting it in the ground requires skill, and it's not impossible. It is absolutely doable, but it is thinking out of the box, and it is being a little more flexible and innovative than the usual government attitude that we all use when we are implementing programs. So therefore, I do not believe that the ICDS will be able to shoulder responsibilities of ensuring simultaneous operation of the components which are required for having an appreciable impact. And the absolutely non-negotiable components are, of course, the ICDS component, the health component, immunization, deworming, etc., and iron and folic acid, water, sanitation. These are non-negotiable. I don't think the Anganwadi can handle that. And if you're going to get another worker into the Anganwadi, that other worker is going to imbibe the entire personality of the Department of Women and Child Development, and you will be having another government worker who will then be in competition with everybody else. So we've adopted a different system and it's 100% coverage of villages. That's a different system, and I think Dr. Shah will have to have another meeting for us to go into how that is being implemented. These were just the other 2 points I want to make.
We'll take you up on that and we will have another meeting. Dr. Sangat?
I'd just like to touch on the point that you mentioned that, though we need to move to make programs for all citizens, we know that poverty is one of the real underlying determinants in many cases for hunger and malnutrition. And there's been shown in several cross-country studies. It's not to say that only the poor are malnourished, but the fact that the poor are likely to be far more malnourished than well-off. It is also a fact that we know, we've been working with socially excluded communities here. There are several barriers that they face in even accessing services. Unless we are mindful of that and trying to breach those barriers, unfortunately, they're not able to access the services. I think that's one point that we have to bear. I agree with you that poor don't want to be labeled as poor. And certainly not, we don't want to make programs only for the poor. That's a real clear way of labeling it as. And unfortunately, it is happening in some places I have seen. I have interviewed mothers and asked them, why have you not sent your child to the Anganwadi center for food? And they said, oh, to both garib logo ke liye. You know, they said we have food. Unfortunately, we don't want that label, but on the other end, it is also a fact that those who need it most there are several barriers, they're not able to access it. You know, because of different kinds of exclusion and poverty, extreme poverty is a real factor that excludes them. That's what I would like to say. The other thing, we've seen this in several debates when we talk about malnutrition. We always, bring in, it is important for every age group. It is important for the old, it's important for adolescent males, it's important for working males. I mean, it can affect their productivity. But when we say focus on certain age groups, focus on certain proven interventions, it is because of the fact that that is a sure way to really break this intergenerational transfer of malnutrition. It is by no means that is the only age group or they are the only interventions that we should do, but not focusing on them or not prioritizing on those interventions would be a big mistake. We can definitely, you do that, and if you are able to extend it to one, the other age groups with other supports, that may be a very good thing. The question is, it's not whether ICDS is the only, response to. The mistake has been that we have treated ICDS as the response to the malnutrition. But it might be a bigger mistake to discard it as it is functional or something that cannot be. It's beyond bad. I would think that we have created this outstanding infrastructure. We have the manpower. There are very few places where you can have 1.4 million centers. And conceptually, no one has ever found fault with ICDS. Even before all these, the first 1,000 days were coined, they had the right group of, the right physiological groups included there, and the right interventions included to make a big difference and, focus on the critical window of opportunity for action. But it never got translated on the ground. It did not get implemented right. So I think we have to use, my urge would be, ICDS alone cannot solve the problem, but we have to find ways of using this excellent infrastructure and a number of other things to make a big difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shankar. We still have a few minutes, and I'm going to ask two people here in the room a question that's sort of been on my mind as I've been thinking about the conference. I'm going to turn to people who've been very influential with the past government. And so we have Naresh here, we have Harsh here. Naresh just stepped down from being a member of the National Advisory Council. Harsh was a member of it. Given...
No, I did not step down. The council was abolished.
Well, I assume you resigned at some point before it was wound up. But you were resigning. So the question is, given 10 years of uninterrupted rule, given NAC 1 and NAC 2, why did the UPA government, with the tremendous power that NAC had to influence it, not tackle this problem? And what were the constraints in your own thinking or in action or in resources that prevented this from happening?
I must admit that till about 2007, that is when the National Family Health Service report was declared, before that, there was no focus at all in the program on ICDS. I had myself written the chapter in the midterm evaluation of the 9th plan, and I was full of praise for the ICDS because I said this is doing very well, and early child education was the main focus of the program. When in 2007 an FLS3 report came, it was a shock. Even the deputy chairman asked me, NC, tell me why is poverty rate lower than the malnutrition rate? I mean, everyone associated malnutrition with poverty at that point in time. And there was hardly any clarity. Government of India, either because of the Supreme Court's pressure or because of that they must do something, they agreed that we will increase the number of centers from 5 lakhs to 14 lakhs. And they will also increase the budget for supplementary nutrition. So these were the two measures taken which they thought would really reduce the malnutrition rate. Now, unfortunately, when the budget for malnutrition, budget for supplementary nutrition increased, there were different lobbies working. Prime Minister announced that he would set up announcement was made that the PM's council was set up. It did not meet for the first 3 years because between the planning commission and the ministry there was a great deal of difference of opinion as to what should be the mode of supplementary nutrition. Should it be hot cooked meal as we were pressing from the Supreme Court side, or should it be biscuits and cooked meat? Prime Minister said that unless you resolve this difference, I am not going to call the meeting. So that took about 3 years. The meeting was called, this point was not discussed at all, and usual platitudes were raised in the meeting, nothing much happened, that we must do something, it's a national shame, etc., etc. So much so that today, in my presentation, I should make there was a chart on that, that the accountability of the lower staff was not at all pressed because they were reporting that only 0.5% children at that point of time were severely malnourished and only 8% children were malnourished. But this difference was not pointed out. What I am trying to say is that first of all, government did not know what to do. Secondly, what needs to be done is totally different from what has been happening. If you are really serious about malnutrition, you must just abolish ICDS system and start what Thailand has been doing, that go to a village and increase people's awareness about this, call a meeting of the Gram Sabha every now and then, make them aware of the number of malnourished children, help ladies who are some leadership, don't give them any money, but build in their pride and in their commitment. That's how it should be done. But this will never happen in our government.
I'll just give a somewhat different answer. I believe that this was, what we witnessed, especially in the latter 5 years of this government, was a government strangely at war with itself, primarily.
Sanjay Baru would certainly agree.
It would, no, I mean, not quite in the way that Sanjay Baru has described. You see, I think that there is a core question that governments across the world have to decide, which is this classical debate about whether economic growth is going to solve problems of unemployment, poverty, hunger, etc. Or whether you need direct state action centrally around these issues even while growth happens. And I believe that the government, the leadership of the government was actually opposed to its own welfare agenda. So it never actually implemented its own programs. There was a continuous strange effort to almost subvert its own programs. The NCAER-IDS was gradually sort of downsized and killed. Other programs. When I look back, I left the NAC after a couple of years. I just found that there was a certain lack of conviction. So, if we go back, I feel that if the government really believed in markets being the solution, they may be right. Then they should do that fully with conviction. If they believed in welfare, they should have done that fully with conviction. In the end of 5 years, they actually had neither story to tell, and that was the problem.
So I guess the one lesson we should take away is that this government shouldn't be of two minds.
Of two minds.
It should absolutely go. With that, I'm going to
we should be of the right mind.
And the right mind, but certainly you could be of the right mind and still be mixed up so completely that you'd be able to do nothing. So with that, I'm going to, I wanted to ask Dr. Desi Raju to really round up, but before then I do that.
One very small comment to what Dr. Shankar said. Dr. Shankar, you would be aware that the coverage of under 3 children or under 2 children by ICDS across the country is minimal. There are many reasons for it, because little children less than 2 cannot have hot cooked meals. They require some special preparations for which there has been a lot of confusion, etc., etc. So the mission, what we are doing in Karnataka and what I would assume the national mission should also do, would concentrate on children under 3 who are very difficult to capture by ICDS. There are enough surveys which tell you that. And also pregnant and lactating women. Their coverage is less than 30% according to our national surveys. So it is not as if one is saying demolish the ICDS, but let the ICDS do what it was intended to do. It was supposed to do pre-primary, preschool education. It was supposed to be the center for immunization, which it has done very well, especially the preschool preparation. They have done brilliantly. And it was supposed to be a place for nutrition information. Unfortunately, that has not happened. But anyway, the ICDS is very well set in its ways, and I don't think it can take on. So it's not that one is saying don't do it, but don't make them responsible for removing malnutrition. They don't have the capacity, they don't have the kind of structure to do that, and the flexibility. That's all I would say.
Would you and also just a sense of what would be the best message that this group could give to the government to trigger them into the kind of mission mode that everybody's talked about?
Thank you, Roshi. You made some very useful summarizing statements yourself, which I think capture the important points that have come out of this afternoon discussion, that the nutrition mission is not limited to women and children. And it is, one panelist used the term that everyone is a consumer. It's not just a program for the poor. Here I would like to again, since I raised this issue originally, I must confess I know where Harsh is coming from, that I only intended to say that the tendency in government is that a program that is seen as benefiting poor people is usually poorly implemented. But I do also see the point that Harsh makes, that in nothing that we do should we lose sight of poorest, because there is also a great danger of appropriation by the not so poor the moment something begins to work well. And this is true even of government schemes. You just have to visit AIMS, for instance, to see what I mean. This is an extraordinarily well-functioning institution where the poor still find it difficult to access treatment there, but no one sitting in this room is ever going to have any problem in accessing any facility that is needed in a government institution that works well. And there's no question of the homeless getting anywhere. So I think that point must be recognized, that the great tendency of the affluent to appropriate. The interesting point that was made about central schemes, that how it cannot just be a central scheme, but that the capacity and willingness of the state governments and the resources of the state governments need to be drawn into it. Not much was said about the nature and role of the private sector. There was some discussion on the new CSR regulations and what they imply, but I get that the consensus seems to be that the leadership needs to be given by government. The leadership needs to be given by government in a mission mode. It seems to me that we are in a position to suggest to the government that the Prime Minister's Council, which it exists, needs to be revitalized, in a sense playing some of the role that the NAC was envisaged to play in the previous government, of providing direction at the highest possible level, using these services not only of people within government, but from people who know the subject from outside government, but with the political authority at the level of the Prime Minister. And pushing for this as a basic imperative, cutting across program sectors, cutting across existing programs. I think that is the kind of message we need to say. We need to think further on those lines and see how this mission can be shaped, who will run it, and how it will be funded. There was the interesting question raised by Dr. Meenakshi, Dr. Raghupadhyay's response that resources at this point in time are not actually the problem. In fact, I see both sides of this. It is clearly at one level resources are not or should not be the problem when we are dealing with a problem, dealing with an issue of this nature. On the other hand, it's nobody's case that resources are wasted. And given that we are in the fortunate position of having the resources, how best can we use this, and which is the most constructive way in which this funds can be used, recognizing that at one level a whole range of activities can indeed be funded. So that's really what I would like to say as to what the takeaways have been from this meeting. But I think the most important thing is that this needs to be a government-driven mission. If we're able to convey that in some way, I think it will work well.
Thank you, Dr. Desiree. Let's just give a round of applause to our panelists. I think